Howdy, folks. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Music, where we talk with musicians, composers, engineers, influencers, etc., people that make their living in the music industry. And I've got a special guest today, a professional, a legend, a dear friend of mine, Michael Laskow, co-founder, not co-founder, the founder, CEO of Taxi.com. But this video is not about Taxi like the many I have on my channel. Be sure to like and subscribe. Check those all out. If you sign up for Taxi, save $100. Is that accurate? No, I think that's accurate.
Look, I wore
No,
my taxi shirt just in
you are for sure. So a lot of folks don't know that Michael has a very lengthy career in the music engineering production business. And at various Taxi rallies and other meetings, we've talked, and you've always just dropped these little nuggets, these stories of, oh, I ran into Phil Spector, or I ran into Eddie Money, or I ran into so and so from the Eagles, and blah blah. I'm like, he's just name dropping like crazy, and it's casual. I'm like, all these brushes with greatness, as Letterman used to say back in the day. So I figured, as a fan of history, I am big on documenting things before those that have the stories, forget the stories or leave us. So I said a couple months ago, Michael, your stories are cracking me up. We need to talk. I need to record it. I have no idea where this is going to go. I've got some notes of where Michael worked, who he's worked with. I'm going to say some names and he's going to say some stories. We'll see where this goes. So, Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. I want to apologize to everybody watching. I started coming down with laryngitis yesterday. Couldn't get anything to come out. Today, my vocal cords are working, but in and out. So I'll be sucking on a cough drop and drinking tea through much of this episode. Hopefully, I'll make it all the way through.
Oh, I think we'll power through it. Well, we can do it. And again, thank you so much for doing this, especially with the vocal cord stuff. So, let's start back in the day. I'm going to go kind of chronologically. You went to the University of Miami and got a bachelor's in business and music. Now, that was in the 70s. Then I want to say the business and music type thing was kind of a new topic. Was that kind of new back then in the 70s at Miami?
Yeah. I grew up in a little farm town in Illinois. I had the dream of being in the music industry when I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show at 9 years old. And jump ahead to senior prom. I was at a post prom party and so a makeout party in somebody's basement. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's record Deja Vu had just come out, and I remember saying to my girlfriend at the time, "Boy, what I wouldn't give to work in a recording studio with people like that."
Wow.
We'll get to that eventually. But yes, when I went to Miami, I got a business degree because I thought I might go to law school.
Yeah.
But I needed some elective classes. I ended up taking so many in music and audio engineering, which was a new thing at Miami at the time, that I got a music minor as well.
So were you a musician or just interested in the engineering side of it?
Well, a real musician wouldn't call me a musician. I definitely was more excited about sitting behind the glass and suggesting changes and stuff to the people on the other side, more so than being on a stage and having adoring fans. Plus, I can play bar chords, I can play open chords. I've got terrible rhythm, and no, I'm a bedroom hack on several instruments.
But a fantastic ear, obviously. So, looking at your chronology, you're at Miami at the same time you started working at Criteria Studios with some very, very famous, historically significant engineers. So, were you working at Criteria while still in school?
I was, much to my parents' disappointment.
Okay.
Um, Sometime after my freshman year, maybe even into my sophomore year, uh, I had a roommate that inherited 30 grand, went to Ace Music, which was kind of the guitar center of North Miami at the time, to return a piece of gear. And I overheard a delivery guy saying he was running an ARP string ensemble over to Criteria for Stills, as in Stephen Stills.
Okay.
Um, and that was how I got my foot in the door. I went pestered him until he let me go with it.
Literally got your foot in the door.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go to Criteria, and you've got engineers Tom Dowd, Arif Martin, Carl Richardson, and Don Gehman, um, all legends. And I found a quote from is it Gehman or Gehman? I want to make sure I pronounce it right.
Gehman.
Gehman. Okay, got it right. So I did a little research, and he was involved with Still's first solo album called Illegal Stills in 1976. And Gehman said about himself, quite frankly, the quality of that record, Illegal Stills, was so poor that it scared me right out of the producing business and into the engineering business. I thought that now I'm not familiar with that album, but now I'm curious to go listen to Illegal Stills and see how bad it is. What can you tell me
I,
about
I don't think it's that bad. And actually, I got to work a little bit on that one when I first started there. I think I started in late 75, and I was like the assistant to the assistant engineer on little bits and pieces of illegal stills.
Now, I think I've heard you say in the past on Taxi TV how you really were just the guy. You were there, and if anyone wanted coffee, you were literally the low man on the totem pole running errands. Is that kind of how you worked your way in the door?
Well, absolutely. The day I went with the delivery guy, he said, "Stay in the lobby, don't talk. This place is famous. It's high security, big stars.
Don't
Just
touch anything, young boy.
right, exactly." And I was sitting there, and the owner of the studio walked through. I could tell he was the owner just by his age and the way he carried himself. And he said to this long hair hippie guy who happened to be Carl Richardson, who I ended up working with a lot. Um, Look at this place. Looking around the lobby, looks like crap. We need a new kid to sweep the floors. So I pestered him. They kicked me out. I called Mack Emerman, the owner, 5 times a day for 5 days straight. 25th call of the week, Friday afternoon, 4 p.m. He said, "All right, come up here. If you interview for the job and it's an internship, doesn't pay anything, and you don't get it, you swear you'll never call again." So that's how I got my foot in the door. And yes, I was the lowest form of life on the totem pole there, but um, I knew immediately how incredibly fortunate I was to be working in a place like that, surrounded by legends
Yeah.
at all levels, legendary artists, producers, and engineers. Every minute of every day. It's not like every now and then you'd bump into them. They were just there within 5 feet of you, 2 feet of you, standing next to you at the water cooler, in a control room with them, in the parking lot, playing horse with a basketball
Yeah.
hoop with them,
I
everywhere.
mean, interacting with these, you know, amazing talents that would become legends if they weren't already. So like Don Gehman, he produced or engineered the Bee Gees, Clapton, Firefall, Streisand, Chicago. And did you get, I mean, when you started, you were an errand boy, go get coffee, sweep the floors, take out the trash. But then you eventually got into the to be near a mixer in the back of the room watching. What was that next phase of your career like?
Assistant engineer, which they don't just label you an assistant engineer at a place like Criteria. It's kind of like working at Abbey Road. You really have to show that you've got the right stuff,
Hmm.
and little bit by little bit, they drip out bits of responsibility. So yeah, um, I graduated from pizza runs or cleaning up studios to labeling tape boxes, just being in the room. Keep your eyes open, your ears open, your mouth shut, and your opinions aren't welcome here. But that was okay because I got to be in the room, some really big guys doing really big stuff,
When you,
and
I
earn their
mean,
trust.
you talk about big guys. Tom Dowd, again, doing my research, had no idea that he worked on the Manhattan Project as a physicist. And he wanted to go to college to finish his degree, but because it was top secret work, university would not acknowledge his experience or give him credit for it. So he said, "Screw it, I'm going into music." And so Dowd was a pioneer of multitracks. He popularized the 8 track. He popularized stereophonic sound, and he's the guy responsible for the linear faders versus the rotary dials. Tom Dowd is the guy that kind of popularized and made mainstream the faders that we all know and love today. So what kind of interaction, if any, did you have with Tom while you were at Criteria?
Countless hours. He was an extreme. He was a little eccentric, but in a very lovable way.
Was with the
Incredibly,
radiation, maybe? Yeah.
very, very, very personable, very outgoing, earned the trust of every musician he went with. His production philosophy was help them pick the right songs, get the right players on the record, get out of the way unless they need you. And when they do need you, you better have a damn good thing to suggest to them
Yeah.
so that they continue to trust and respect you. So, yes, I got illegal stills. I remember him being kind of in and out of the control room on that. So that was the first time I got to see him work. And I just kept my mouth shut, my ears and eyes open.
You remember the decks that you were working on at the time?
Yeah, MCI, JH 24 tracks, which had just come in, they were relatively new on the scene back then. Um, It was an original MCI console. That record was done in Studio B at Criteria, where Layla was done. Bits and pieces of Allman Brothers records, like Eat a Peach, were done in that room. And it had Criteria had two consoles that were made by MCI, which is Music Centers Incorporated. A guy named G. Parnett owned it, based in Fort Lauderdale, about 20 minutes away from Criteria, which was in North Miami. And Mack Emerman, the owner of Criteria, went there with an Ampex 2-track to get it serviced. And G. Parnett said, I can build a better one. And that was the birth of, at the time, it was like an SSL or a Neve.
Yeah.
My personal opinion is it didn't sound as good. SSLs weren't around yet. Neves were mostly known in Europe, but not so much in America. And G. Parnett and Mack Emerman ended up becoming really good friends, and all the MCI gear was tested on Criteria's people. But going back to the original question, yes, that control room had a two-off MCI console. Because Atlantic Records, Tom Dowd, Arif Martin, those guys from Atlantic and New York did so much work at Criteria because it was kind of a warm and sunny place they could go in the winter. They wanted the same consoles that they had at Atlantic Studios in New York. So MCI would build identical consoles, two at a time, for Criteria and for Atlantic New York. So in that room, Illegal Stills was done on a MCI black anodized aluminum surface. Nothing like what we see today.
Right.
If you wanted to service the console, which was about the size of two-thirds of a dining room table, you lifted it up and propped it up with two by
All the
fours.
wires and stuff kind of
Yeah,
like
it
that. Yeah.
crawled into the belly pan on your back and put on big shop glasses and soldered bad connections on your back with the solder hitting you.
Practical skills you needed. You mentioned Arif Martin, another legend from Turkey, Atlantic Records, EMI, Manhattan Records, produced the Bee Gees' first album. Some say he's the guy that
Not
discovered
their first album, but their comeback record, which had Jive talking on it. Yeah.
jive. Yeah, they say he kind of discovered the high voice, the Bee Gees sound, and pretty cool stuff. He had 40 gold records, 15 Grammy knobs, and 12 Grammy wins, which is pretty cool company to be along with. Legendary track record of artists he worked with. What kind of stuff did you do or engage with Arif?
Um, Everything. If Tommy Dowd was in a room, Arif was probably in a
Okay.
room with them. But I can tell you a great story about the two of them, which kind of set me on my course.
Okay.
Um, I was vacuuming the lobby of Studio C at Criteria, which was across the parking lot, but somehow connected to the original Criteria building. And I'm over there vacuuming the orange shag carpet, and I see two older gentlemen, which were younger then than I am now, but they were playing a very heated game of pinball. And I walked up in the middle of the game and tapped one of them on the shoulder and turned off my vacuum and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me how you make a hit record?" And they looked at me like, what a twerp. I can't believe this guy just, they were playing blood sport pinball and I just
Okay.
killed the game. And Arif looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at Arif, and Tommy turned around and said to me, with Arif doing one of these, um, said, kid, um, on the other side of this wall, and we were on the back side of the Studio C control room wall, and you could hear bum 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 coming through the wall, which was "Do You Think I'm Sexy?" I think
Yeah.
by Rod Stewart. He said we've got the best studio players money can buy, one of the greatest artists of all time, best studio money can buy. I don't know if we're making a hit record. And then he pointed out a window, and about a half a mile away down a long street, you could see a bunch of nondescript warehouses. And he said, in one of those warehouses is a kid with a TAC 4-track, because that was the only kind of home studio that existed back then.
Yeah.
He said, and that kid's making a hit record. You know why? And I went, oh. He said, because he wrote a hit song. That's how you make hit records.
There you go.
And he and Arif spent like 5 minutes giving me kind of their broad overview of you got to pick the right artist, absolutely have to pick the right songs, give the artist enough leash to be the artist they are, but don't let them hang themselves,
Mm.
practical stuff like that.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so at this time, and we're almost done with criteria. I mean, there's so many great chapters in your life here. the artists that you work with, Firefall, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Clapton, James Brown, Tom Bolan, Peter Yarrow. Firefall, the song "You Are the Woman" was number 9. Lunacy, Elan, those albums were there in the '70s. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, "Just a Song Before I Go" went to number 7, and that was
Didn't
kind
work
of
on that one. That was
didn't.
after me, but okay.
Okay, gotcha. Well, did you do any work with Clapton? He did several albums there.
Yeah,
Um, were you on Slow Hand?
no, I was before that.
Okay.
He had just released 461 Ocean Boulevard that had his big comeback hit, which was I Shot the Sheriff, Bob Marley
The
song.
remake of the Marley song. Yeah.
Yeah, and that launched Eric into the stratosphere. And so that record was out. He was touring to support it. He was friends with everybody at Criteria. He was a regular fixture there. Um, and he came back to work on an album called "There's One in Every Crowd,"
That was in '75. Yeah.
which was is not a very well-known record, but that was one where I was the assistant to the assistant with Tom Dowd and Arif Martin in the room.
Okay.
And again, I got to learn from them. Um,
The following
but
year was No Reason to Cry. Were you on that in '76? No?
no, no. What I did, what Eric got to know me a little bit because I was the quiet kid in the back of the control room on There's One in Every Crowd. He came back several months later with two guys named Tom and Don. There were a couple of pot smoking hippies camped out on the beach behind Eric's house in Nassau, Bahamas. And I'm pretty sure they camped out there hoping he would stumble upon them someday. And they were just long haired acoustic guitar playing guys. And Eric ended up jamming with them, going down there to write with them every day, really liked them, and brought them to Criteria for the purpose of doing demos slash masters for RSO Records, which was Robert Stigwood's company,
Okay.
that Clapton was on at the time, label that he was on, with the hope that they would get a record deal, blah, blah, blah. So I was the assistant engineer on that one. And that was where, again, even though I was the assistant engineer, I kept my mouth shut, my eyes open, kind of thing. And Clapton would interact with me a lot. He liked my work ethic, I think, and he was a little amused by me somehow.
And you're in your young to mid 20s at this point, right?
I was probably 19 or 20.
Oh,
Yeah.
good Lord. Wow. Okay. Young boy. So you just look innocent, I have this Disney caricature of a big brown-eyed kid in the back, like, please, sir, may I have some more?
But they taught you not to be agog by the whole thing. That was
Yeah.
part of the ethos of Criteria. Always act like a professional. As a matter of fact, I became friendly with Eric Clapton over a period of the next year or so. Worked on several different short sessions, things that would, where he'd come in for 3 days or a week or a night or whatever. And he invited me to his house in the Bahamas. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, come on down. Cheap flight. It was like $57 round trip on a little pontoon seaplane.
Yeah.
And I had to go to my boss to get permission. And he said, don't take any drugs while you're there. Remember, you represent Criteria when you're on the ground at his house. So
Good
yeah,
stuff.
I ended up going down to his house.
Wow.
Um, I went there many times during that next year.
He seems
He
like a very
liked me.
laid back person.
He was. I mean, there were nights where it'd just be Eric and me sitting on his patio, like a big veranda thing that
Yeah.
overlooked Nassau Harbor, and just be the two of us hanging out. And he
Wow.
once did told me the rumors of my drug abuse are greatly exaggerated. Thought
Okay.
that was interesting. I never saw him do massive quantities of drugs. He liked sipping Jack Daniels and Courvoisier. Smoked a lot of Rothman cigarettes. Would probably take the occasional hit off a joint, but he wasn't a big partier. He was, and he once said to me, "Pardon me if I'm going,
No,
off
no,
on a
this is
tangent, but
exactly why
this
we're
is cool."
talking, Michael.
He once said to me, "I don't like the sound of my own voice. I
Huh.
don't like singing my own songs, but other people seem to like it and it works. So yeah, whatever."
Did he
But
ever
he would
talk to you
sit there.
about his musical influences, blues, guitar,
No,
things? Oh, no?
never talked to me about his influences, but he would sit there with an acoustic guitar. He had a Martin acoustic and would just sit there noodling all the time.
Wow.
And he'd play a little thing and go, "What do you think?" And he wasn't trying to impress me. It was more just playing chords and finding cool voicings and does this work with that?
Wow.
So one of my trips down there, the Rolling Stones were there on a break from a tour for a weekend. And at the end of the weekend, he and Ronnie Wood went into Eric's library and they were jamming along with Muddy Waters, I think, that they had like on a turntable on vinyl. And they were jamming along, and I recorded them mixed with Muddy Waters onto a two track.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I mean, and that's how you learn music. You play along with, well, at least I did, play along with records, and I had to move the needle to go back where I wanted. Um,
Yeah.
so, the last thing here in this wonderful studio, you got this work with James Brown. In the 70s, he became the godfather of soul, and he did a bunch of albums of good and questionable quality. But what interaction, if any, did you have with JB?
Well, he did I Feel Good at Criteria. That was the studio's first big hit. I believe that my boss, Mack Emerman, might have engineered that one, and it was a
Okay.
one-room facility. And he always just came back there. Um, Pretty much everybody in the staff worked with him for a night or a week or a month at some point. I had not. And he came back to work on something. I don't remember what the song was or songs. He always traveled with an entourage. He
Yeah.
was diminutive. I was
Right.
surprised that he was not a big guy because you look at a star and you think they're larger than life
Right.
physically. He was not. He really didn't pay that much attention to me, other that he was very polite. If I brought him water or whatever, he would say thank you and look me in the eye. The funny thing was we had to have one of those parquet fold out dance floors underneath him while he was recording his vocals because he would be out there moving and
Moving his
grooving
feet.
as
Yeah, that's a natural
yeah.
move. That's amazing. That's hysterical. Now, I'm sorry, I thought another thing. It seems like Dowd was, saying you represent the company when you're at Clapton's place. He seems like a pretty straightforward, clean cut guy. Was the studio clean, or was it smoky? Was it messy? I mean, you hear stories about lots of studios on VH1 behind the scenes, or you see biographies of crazy, ugly studios with beer spilled on couches and such. Was this a clean studio? Was it an average studio? What was the atmosphere like?
It was considered to be a very attractive looking studio, even
Mhm.
though we had like carpet on, shag carpet on a lot of the
It was
floors,
great back then. That was the thing.
carpeting on the walls, Pecky cedar, Pecky cypress, polycylindricals on the wall for some diffusion. Um, Mac Emerman took a lot of pride in that place, and I would say that it was an attractive studio that got beer spilled,
Mm.
had a lot of marijuana smoke, had a lot of cigarette smoke. Back then, we all knew that cigarette smoke was bad for the contacts on the faders and the switches, but you couldn't say
Never
no. It
stop.
wasn't a thing
Exactly.
where you had to go outside to smoke again. Um, there were a lot of inhalable substances being used.
Okay.
Miami in the mid 70s.
Yeah, I gotcha.
So one time there's one very famous artist, I won't mention his name, but worked on a record with him and other famous people. And when he left town, somebody else on the staff said to me, go get a Phillips head screwdriver. And I did. And they said, here, help me take the keyboard off of the B3, legendary B3 that was on many, many, many
Mm.
records that you would know. Lifted up the keyboard, and there was I don't know, half an ounce of cocaine down, mixed in with dust and whatever else
Wow.
underneath her, because this particular artist would take a business card, dip it into like a pound bag, and go and snort it, and
It's
just
falling
crumbs were
out.
constantly falling. So that was kind of funny.
Get a contact high from playing a keyboard. Wow.
Eventually, I got a call one day from a woman named Margie, who's still a very close friend of mine. She was the person that assigned engineers to sessions. Unless you got requested by the artist, the front office would say, you should go work on this record. I hadn't been requested on anything. Um, they put me on Firefall because the band wasn't famous yet. Nobody else wanted to work with them.
Okay.
And I got to set up the whole session. I took a Recording Institute of America, RIAA, whatever that stands for, course on audio engineering with Carl Richardson, legendary engineer producer, teaching it. And so I walked in the control room. They were already unloading gear and kind of getting set up and getting to know each other. And he said, "Oh, you're it, huh?" And he sounded a little disappointed, like, "Oh, crap, I got the rookie." And I said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, you've taken my course. Set the room up how you think I would like it." And I set
Okay.
it up and I came in the room, control room, and he said, You nailed it. First pass. Good job,
Nice.
kid. Um, so that was the first record I worked on. And the first song they cut was the rhythm track of You Are the Woman. And it was killing me to keep my mouth shut because it was obvious that it was a hit record
Mm.
with nothing more than the rhythm track and a scratch vocal going on.
And that went to
So
number 9 on the charts in America.
yeah, and it was the first time I worked on anything that I ever heard on the radio. I happened to be visiting my parents near Chicago, sitting in the back seat of their car after they picked me up at the airport, and it came on the radio. And, anybody who's ever had something hit the radio on a big national station knows that feeling of, wow, I was there. Um, so I don't know, maybe 6 months, 9 months later, whatever period of time passed, um, Margie called me in the control room, and I knew that Stephen Stills and Neil Young were under the roof working with Don Gehman on a record with just the two of them that they were going to call Stillborn Young.
Okay.
Label didn't like that name,
Yeah.
Stillborn. And at some point, they'd had a big breakup with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had dissolved.
Right.
Lots of infighting, and anyway, Margie called me up and she said, I need you to assist on this record. Don's engineering it and co producing it. And Graham and David are coming in today. It's going to be a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young record. So that went back to just a couple of years before where I was at the prom makeout party,
Yeah,
post
that's
prom
right.
makeout party. And I said to my girlfriend, what I wouldn't give to work in a recording studio with an act like that.
And there you are.
So I literally was it was hard for me, but I did. I kept my mouth shut, my eyes and ears open. We worked 37 days without leaving the building. Don and I did, because Graham and David would come in and do their part for maybe 8, 10, 12 hours a day. Stephen and Neil would work the next 8, 10, 12 hours. Don and I had to be there for all of it. Some days, all four of the guys would be there. Usually, when they laid down rhythm tracks, they did most of the rhythm tracks for that album were done with like a full band live in the studio. Um, and wow, all I
Yeah.
can say is wow, Stephen here's something most people don't know about Stephen Stills. He's an incredible B3 player. Most people just don't know that.
Hmm.
He's a great pianist. Most people don't know that about him. He's an incredible lead guitar player. Some would argue with that. I wouldn't. Graham Nash, nicest guy in the world, kind of a peacekeeper in the band. David
Hmm.
Crosby was at the peak of his abuse.
Hmm.
Not the nicest guy, but incredibly talented. Ended up marrying our night receptionist, Jan Dance. And she was married to him all the way up until his recent passing. Um, and Neil Young, um, hard to explain Neil, but he tried really hard not to get involved in the emotional stuff and the fights. But you put that much talent, those four guys, each one of which was a star in their
Yeah.
own right, and you put them in a room, and when they are of a mind to, and they come together, the magic you feel in that room could only be secondary to witnessing a Beatles session. It was that powerful and that good, and
So,
I got to work hundreds of hours with them.
so two questions. This I want to come to the creative process in a second. But what was the actual physical setup like? Were drums in a separate room? Were they all in the same room? Were they close to each other? I mean, how far apart were they spread to avoid bleed? What was your physical layout that you nailed the first time?
Okay, that was Firefall,
Oh,
not
fire, my bad,
Crosby,
my bad.
Stills.
Okay, but what was the typical layout like? What kind of isolation, if any, was there,
For the
etc.?
Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young record, I learned something really valuable that would come back to benefit me later in my career, which was here's how you set up a live room where everybody can play live. We get good enough separation, but great line of sight for the players.
Hmm.
Enough bleed that it worked, but not so much that it didn't. And for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, we had the room set up kind of an electric and percussion set up at the back of the room. It was done in Studio B, which was probably about 25 feet wide and 30-ish feet deep. As a matter of fact,
Oh, there you go.
there is a picture of Neil Young's guitar rig during what ended up being Long May You Run.
I see a trash can in front with a garbage bag in it. Is that implying anything? Like someone's gonna
No,
be sick or?
that was just me tidying up the room at the
Gotcha. Took
end
a
of the
picture.
night. I happened to put it down there, and then I remembered, oh yeah, we had to take Polaroids of everything because there was no automation.
Right, right, right.
So we would take Polaroids of equalizers, faders, sends, everything, and take Polaroids of mic placements and instrument placements out in the room
What is that small gray box to the right? You got guitar to the left, amp in the center, the small gray box to the right.
with the
Looks like it's
round
some,
thing on the face of it.
well, yeah, I'm not sure what that is at all. Is it
A Con Strobo tuner.
oh, tuner? Gotcha, strobo tuner. There you go.
Yeah,
God.
Neil loved those. Probably still uses it knowing him. So
Yeah.
yeah, and he actually had his whole guitar set up going through a little PA out in the room. And if memory serves, I think I'm right about this. He had like maybe a Fender Twin or something, but rather than, I mean, pedals as we know them today weren't really a thing back then. But Neil used servo motors on flexible little wires. Like when you were a kid and you had that battery thing like a flashlight that connected to a little airplane that you would
Right,
fly
right,
around.
right.
So whatever that turning thing was inside of a sleeve, he had that connected to the knobs on his amp. So he could whack a button with his foot and it would turn up the input on the amp to
Huh.
overdrive it for a solo.
Nice.
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, I mean, he was big into, his in private hobbies. He loved custom trains, train sets. And there's a
Right.
lot of electronics and stuff going on. He just seemed, I guess he was a natural electrician to do something like that. Now, which album was that for, that picture you said?
That was started out as Stills Young, then
Still young.
became Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And then Graham and David either wanted off the record or got kicked off the record. I had gone back to Steven's house to crash on his couch in Miami Beach because I lived more than an hour away from the studio. And after 37, 38 days straight of being there, we decided to take a break, like a legit weekend off, and still said, you can come back to my place and crash. So I remember I walked through the front door, was crashed out on a leather couch somewhere on the first floor of the house. And he, like 2 hours later, shook me and woke me up and said, I've got an idea for a song. We need to go back to the studio. And I'm like, oh, crap. I literally said something like, what the F are you doing? When he was shaking me,
Yeah,
trying
you
to
just
wake
wake
me
it
up.
up a deep sleep. Yeah.
So I called Margie, the studio manager, and she said, "Go to Studio C. Don't touch anything in B where you're working on the record. Don wouldn't like that." And she was right. So I took Steven into Studio C that was dark and empty and set him up with an electric guitar amp and mic that and a vocal mic. And he played down, 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 over and over and over until about the sun came up. Okay.
Okay.
And then he went home and I just crashed on the couch in the lobby of Criteria. A few hours later, the staff showed up. The receptionist woke me up, said, Don Gehman's on the phone for you. Hey, Don, what's up? And he goes, Graham and David are off the record. They flew back to San Fran last night. It's Stills Young again. We had 118 reels of 2-inch tape, is my recollection of that. And
Wow.
Don said, go start erasing the stuff that's got Graham and David on it.
Golly.
And you can't admit, my hands were trembling. I was probably 20, 21 years old. And to be tasked with that, especially after basically sleeping while leaning up against the back wall of the control room for a month,
Yeah.
didn't have my wits about me. But yeah, there was a Stone article that came out. We'd love to kill the guy that erased all that stuff. Well, it wasn't my decision, but I was the guy who was tasked with at least a good portion of it.
Wow. It's like the Watergate 18 minutes of missing tape. Okay, okay, we're dating ourselves now if we're referring to Watergate here, and tape for that matter. It sounds like just an amazing time. Back to the creative process. When they were all there, were they working on songs they had previously worked out, or did you witness them creating on the spot?
All of the above. They would each bring songs into the sessions. I think people were vying to get their music onto the album because of publishing. They wanted to make more money on publishing, but they also respected the creativity of the four of them together. Um, oh, and you asked, I didn't really answer well about the room setup.
Oh
So,
yeah.
looking out of the control room, in the back of the room was the drum kit with I can't think of his name. not Jerry Aiello. He was playing keyboards. Uh, anyway, um, drum set with gobos around it.
Hmm.
So it was out in the room, but splayed off to some extent. There was a vocal booth out there that had an acoustic guitar mic and a vocal mic in there if somebody wanted to use that. It didn't get used often, but I think that Joe Lala, who played percussion live on a lot of those tracks, ended up in there for maybe something that had a cowbell or something that would really bleed all over the room. Um, and then Neil's rig that I just showed you was off to the right of the room as you looked out of the control room. And Steven was on the left side with a couple of amp choices. And I think that I had Sony ECM 377s or possibly Sony 37Ps and 57s on most of the amps. Um, what else can I tell you? And then towards the front of the room, not very far out from the glass, we called it the tree, which was four vocal mics, four acoustic guitar mics. And there were times that the four of them would gather around the tree and noodle on a song. And we had to keep tape running.
Yeah.
Bare minimum quarter-inch tape had to be running. If any one of the four of them was physically in the building, tape had to be running because you
Wow.
never knew when they could walk in the room
Yeah.
and play something and then 2 weeks later say, remember that rainy Wednesday night at like 4 o'clock in the morning? I was noodling on that. So that was one of my tasks as the assistant, was to keep a running log of all that stuff and go, yeah, that
Wow.
was real number 57. Here you go, 4 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday. Um, and here's a great story, which was at some point, I was allowed to set up a rough mix, or maybe set up a rough mix for a vocalist to get a vocal every now and then, record a vocal, whatever. Don Gehman said to me one night, can you man the helm? He was either having some digestive distress or
Hmm.
maybe an important phone call with his wife, whatever it was. He said, I'm leaving the control room. Um, can you run this thing? He knew I could run it. He said, can you run this thing? And I said, put me in, coach.
Yeah.
And I sat down, and the four guys started noodling on a song that became Taking It All, that I believe Graham wrote. And it it ended up in the movie Up in the Air, about the guy who traveled around the country firing people, George Clooney.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's in there. So while Gaiman was out of the room, the four of them are noodling, and I said, guys, please sit down at the tree. I was definitely talking above my pay grade. I hit the talk back button and said, guys, this is one of your best songs ever. Please sit down at the tree and let me just get one pass of this so we've got it.
Yeah.
And they sat down and they nailed it. But during the course of it, Stills hit his thumb on the body of his Martin and kind of whacked it a little too hard. And he looked up at me like, did I just completely mess that up? And I went, it's cool. And they
Oh,
kept rolling and they finished it. That version was one of the few things that survived that album. I
wow.
don't know how it somebody got their hands on it, but it ended up in that movie 40 some years later. And I'm sure it's the version because it's got Stills whacking
You can
the
hear that. It's an audible thing you can hear.
oh, absolutely, you can hear it. It's like almost too loud in that track. But I remember it's the only time in my career I ever pinched my leg. And I was also saying to them, like, Graham, move in a little on your vocal
You're
mic.
bossing them around, these legends, and you're telling them what to do,
Yeah,
and they're listening to you.
barely. Crosby was not happy about it. Neil was all the way in the back of the room tuning his guitar and refused to come over and sit down. He wasn't being a jerk about it. He just wasn't that into the song. But if you listen carefully to the track, I mean, literally, like put it under a microscope, you can hear Neil finding his harmony note 30, probably 30 feet away in the back of the
And
room.
again, what song, what title of the song
It's
here?
called Taken, Taken at all.
Taking it all.
And if you search for it on YouTube, you'll see that they had wrong information saying that it was done the wrong year. Ronnie and Howie
Gotcha.
Albert did it. And so I went on there and said, wrong, people, you got the wrong information. Here's the real story. So,
Nice. You
yeah.
commented. Great. Back to the setup for a second. Um, How did you mic the drum kit? How many mics? Was it three, two, seven? How many mics did you remember using on that kit?
Um, Probably every drum was mic'd.
Okay.
The engineers, first of all, we didn't have a lot of tracks back then, and we didn't have
Right.
consoles with a lot of faders or inputs back then. So it was not uncommon still to do what I would call kind of a jazz setup, where maybe you had kick drum, snare drum, and overheads, and the
Right.
overheads
The
picked
main
up the
three. Yeah.
excuse me, and the overheads would pick up the toms as well as the cymbals. And I
Right.
learned a thing which most people don't even do these days, which was taking an 87 or a 414, putting it in figure eight, and then finding the sweet spot between the cymbals and the toms,
Yeah.
so that you could get the left and right spread between the high tom and the mid tom, um, and also get the cymbals. So that took some skill and ears, and you committed that stuff to a stereo pair of tracks.
Yeah.
But by that time, we probably on that record probably used a 57 on the snare, 421 um, rolled off on the kick drum, probably 87s on the high tom, mid tom, um, maybe a Sennheiser 441, the really long one that's kind of a square, elongated rectangular
Yeah.
mic that was used a lot by Fleetwood Mac on their vocals. Oddly enough, I hated that mic. Um, and we oftentimes didn't use bottom mics on snares or tom toms.
Right.
It was also not uncommon to take the bottom skins off of the toms, even though we didn't mic them from underneath. So something that Tommy Dowd imbued to the engineering staff there, and I learned from the staff and Tommy, which was don't overdo it. Use what you
Keep it simple.
need. Yeah, keep it simple, stupid. And that was it. Acoustic guitars and vocals were all 87s. Like I said, probably Sony 37Ps or ECM 377s on the guitar amps as well as 57s. And then a couple of vocal mics out in the room because they could be jamming, doing a 5 minute, very loose jam that was kind of jazz based with stills on the B3. And he might get up from the B3, walk over, pick up his Strat, his beautiful Sunburst Strat, walk over and just pick up the guitar, kind of look at us in the control room like, am I up? Yep, you're up. And just start playing a lead on the jam and then ad-libbing a vocal into a
Wow.
57. That was every day at work. Boy, was I lucky to get to be
No
there for that
kidding.
stuff.
And then you said you dropped the word, you said the C word, commit. People today, especially home studio musicians, etc., don't understand the skill and the pressure of having to commit. This is the mix I'm going to dump to two track. And I can't change it once it's done. And I got these musicians
I
here and
dumped
these
the two tracks on the multi-track. Yeah,
right,
well,
right, yeah,
still some people were doing 16 track. Most people started doing 24 by then. But yeah,
right. It's
um,
just, I mean, to have you got to be, and that's why engineers got really, really good at their craft because they had to get it right. And if you didn't, it was all hell to pay.
on that score, I'm one of the luckiest people you've ever met in your life because I was taught those things. And I look forward to the day where I can sit down with Logic on my laptop and do some actual work again because I learned all the physics of
Right,
sound
right.
from these masters of the craft. And I would love to be able to use them with, everything that's in Logic.
It's all there. It's all there.
Yeah, I'm going to show you something. This was the last control room I worked in every day when I was in New York City. And by that point, I was doing like big jingles in New York and a lot of audio posts. I had a 48 input SSL, 6048, and
Wow.
that had far less stuff than Logic has on my laptop.
Oh,
This was
absolutely.
a, this was a $3 million room, and I could do so much more in Logic, and I'm just learning Logic kind of
No,
by
well,
accident.
it's a great. There's a million great YouTube tutorials on everything you could ask about Logic. If you think about technology, I just heard. I'm a tech geek, tech guy by day. Heard last week that Voyager 1, the original Voyager, that's 15 billion miles away, had left our solar system, had broken last week or earlier this week. It just started resending usable information, and someone put a comment said it's amazing what NASA did. Voyager 1 has less compute power than a Mother's Day card. when you
Yeah.
open up a Talking Mother's Day card. So technology has changed quite a bit.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am going to hold up next a photograph of a drum kit that I'd mic'd for a session at
Okay.
Criteria in Studio A, like where they did Eat a Peach and Firefall and stuff like that, if you
Okay.
want to see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Looking at it here, what do we got? I see
this is a drum kit that I had mic'd at Criteria. This was in Studio A. Probably, I think this was, I had already moved to New York, but went back to Criteria to produce a record, and this was a drum kit. So I've got PML, Pearl Mic Labs mics on the overheads. Those I learned about from Bill Simzik, he used PMLs on his overheads
mhm.
for the Eagles records. 414s on the toms, which after I discovered how beautiful they sounded on this particular pair of toms, I ended up using them a lot in my career.
Mhm.
Um, and that's it. And you see the gobos around the kit.
Right.
So those are probably the same gobos that we used on the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young thing. So you could see the drummer had a line of sight, but some of the sound was blocked off.
Gotcha.
And
Clear
that
head.
thing hanging up there was called a cloud. It was a lighting cloud. That room was big enough to record an orchestra in,
Mm.
and you could shrink it by moving the walls in. They were all in these giant casters, so you could make it bigger or larger, and you could lower the clouds up or down. And I think on this record, I ended up putting some mics on the cloud. I don't know if they're
Okay.
in there on
Yeah, I
that
think
or
you see
not.
the top there. It looks like it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then would raise it up and lower it
Get the
down.
room noise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. A lot of fun. I mean, that's the stuff you don't get when you're working in Logic or Cubase or Pro Tools or whatever.
You know what else you don't get? My first day at Criteria, a guy named Steve Gursky, who was one notch on the ladder above me, said to me, "Okay, kid, so your first job here is cleaning the console in that room, Studio A." And he gave me a bottle of lemon oil and a Q-tip with a wood stick on it.
Ugh,
Said, "You get a tiny little drop of oil on here, not enough to leak into the faders. And you have to sit there and go and clean this entire, like
right.
6 foot wide console because it hasn't been cleaned in years, looks like crap."
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay." He said, "But I'm going to make it interesting for you. I'm going to put something on the 16 track and put it on auto loop so it plays over and over. And you can sit here and while you're cleaning with your left hand, you can bring up the faders with the right." It was Layla,
Wow. Wow.
which was recorded at Criteria. And so, yeah, my first day on the job, I got to remix Layla.
Nice. Wait, now this reminds me of something. I don't know if this is criteria. You tell a story about some master tapes in the trash that you rescued. Was that criteria? There's
No,
something.
that was many, 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 many years later.
Okay.
When I was at Taxi, my assistant called me up. I was out at a meeting with a bunch of lawyers for something. And my assistant called up, said, "I'm looking at a 2-inch 16 track of the Eagles song, Take It Easy, that's for sale." And I said, "That can't be real." And he goes, "No, it's, looks real." And I said, "All right, top me out of $500. If it's $501, don't even consider it."
Yeah.
And he called me back like 2 hours later, said, "I won the auction for $70." And I said, "Good, because it's probably blank tape and it's bogus anyway, but what the
Yeah.
hell?" So the thing showed up 3 weeks later, and it was, in fact, a 16 track, 2-inch master of the Eagles recording at, I want to say, Olympic Studios in London with Glenn Johns, who had done Led Zeppelin, and he did the first Eagles record with Take It Easy. And it's all there. I gave it to a friend of mine who worked at Capitol Studios in Hollywood. He baked it, transferred it to digital, and I've got it
Wow.
on my laptop.
And it was properly labeled, all the notes and stuff where the musicians,
Yeah.
etc.
If
Wow.
you want me to go grab it, it's 10 feet away from me.
Sure, why not?
Hang on. So there it is, Olympic Sound Studios,
Wow, jeez.
Glenn Johns, Eagles. Um,
I mean, that's
and
crazy.
on the back, oops, tape is falling out the
I mean,
box.
yeah.
There's the track sheet.
Jeez Louise.
There were a couple of
Wow.
Eagles songs. Anyway, says Old Master of Take It Easy. And if you
Okay.
listen to it side by side with the radio version, it's slightly slower, but all the parts are there, solos there. All the vocals on their own tracks. And this was, did they have a date on it?
On the back, I thought I saw a date on the track listing of this.
1970, July 15th, 1972.
Wow.
Um, 15 Ips, real number 8, Asylum Records,
And
spelled
that
wrong.
tape is over 50 years old.
Yeah.
That's,
And
but you've already got it digitized.
yes, I do.
Now, do you have individual tracks or just a
Yeah.
mix? So
Yeah.
now you can dump that into Logic and use that to learn Logic better.
That's exactly what I'm learning Logic with. During the lockdown, that's what I did was I set out to do a remix of it that sounded exactly like the record, the radio version of it, which was done by Glenn Johns. But I also was under the roof at Criteria with Bill Simzik, who did one of these nights in Hotel California at Criteria, and I got to learn a lot about his technique. So then I did a remix that sounded like Bill Simzik would have done it, and
Wow.
accomplished both of those things. And I remember sitting in my house all by myself during lockdown, thinking, "Wow, I've still got it." Pardon my ego, but
No, that's
all those
great.
things I learned back in my first few years are still with me, and yeah, pretty satisfying feeling.
That's amazing. I mean, so criteria seems to be the bulk of your education, the motivation and passion that you have about this engineering thing. I mean, I've been a musician my whole life on the performing side, and it wasn't until I joined Taxi back in 2015 where I realized there's another side. I have to learn how to record and mix, and I've got just such crazy good respect for engineers that know what the heck they're doing. It's a totally different skill set than being a performer or being a composer or a singer. It's an art for those that do it right. And so, I mean, you got an amazing amount of
But it's
fantastic experience.
but it's old school stuff,
Yeah,
and people
yeah.
might laugh at it because nowadays to get a snare sound, you use 16 snare drums to get the right blend of what you want. But back in my day, we used a well-placed microphone, probably no compression on it whatsoever, a
Yeah.
57 that, we rolled off a lot of the severe bottom and maybe added like +1 at 100 hertz and +2 or +4 at 5K or 8K. And that was it. You got
Yeah.
a sound, and it sounded great. It sounded, frankly, in many cases, better than somebody using a DAW today and adding tons of tracks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, if we could, I'd like to move on to your next studio gig at Triad. Is that cool?
Hmm.
I mean, there's so much greatness. I mean, we could just end this interview right now and call it the Criteria Studios History Lesson with Michael Laskow. But that's just a couple of chapters of your musical story. So let's talk about Triad. You were there from the late '70s, early '80s. Some names to drop that you were with: Neil Young, Cheap Trick, Melanie. Um, I've got a question about Cheap Trick. I don't think you were there. My The girl next door, Alice, she's my oldest friend. I've known her since I was 3. She used to play Cheap Trick out her window all the time as a kid to combat me practicing my saxophone. And our houses faced each other. My bedroom window faced her bedroom window, and they were literally 20 feet apart with bushes between. And so I start practicing my saxophone, and she would blare out "I Want You to Want Me" by Cheap Trick. Now I think that's off the In Color album in '77. That might have been before you got to Triad. So do you remember what albums you worked on with Cheap Trick when you were at Triad?
It was just one song, one
Okay.
project, and it was over the course of maybe 3 days.
Oh, there it is.
Three
Hello.
days. Sorry. Like I said earlier, my voice is, yeah, seemed to be getting laryngitis or getting over it. I'm not sure. Anyway, um, got a call. They were in town on tour. Triad was in Fort Lauderdale. It was the only other world-class facility in South Florida at the time, and it was built by a lot of the same people that built Criteria, so it mimicked Criteria.
Hmm.
I went there because I was producing a band, can't remember which one, but I couldn't get into Criteria because it was booked solidly with the Bee Gees, um, Clapton, Eagles, whatever, for like a year forward.
Hmm.
So I heard about this studio. I went up there and went, wow, this is Criteria equivalent. Brought the thing there and ended up never leaving because they didn't have like a house engineer, and I became the guy and ended
Hmm.
up running the place for 5.5 years.
So what was that
So
separation like? Was that like a surprise? Were they sad to see you go? Was it like congratulations? Were they upset? I mean,
I don't think anybody said anything. I was very touched. Right before COVID, they had a reunion at Criteria, and I got invited
Wow.
to the reunion. And I said to the person who was putting it on, I mean, there were like 200 people there, and you can
Mhm.
imagine, kind of a star-studded
Yeah.
years, producers, some artists. Um, it was an outdoor thing. It started on a Friday night in Studio A at Criteria and then went through the weekend. And I said to somebody, I was only here for like 2 years and some odd months. I'm surprised anybody remembers me. And I was so flattered. The guy said, "You're legend here."
Huh,
And I
how
said,
awesome is
"Why?"
that?
Yeah, and I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, apparently you made a lot of people happy when you were here, and then you started a little thing called Taxi. You're a legend, dude." So
Wow.
that was
How touching
one
is
of the,
that? I'm gonna grab
yeah,
my
it was pretty
coffee.
touching. It wasn't so much for my ego as it was for my heart.
Well, that definitely definitely fills your bucket. Um, to be remembered that way, especially when you were expecting it. That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So I see Neil Young. So you were there from like late 70s, 77, 78 to 82. So Young's albums then were American Stars and Bars, Comes a Time, Rust Never Sleeps, Hawks and Doves, and Reactor. Were you involved with any of those?
Yes.
Okay.
Um, I got a call from my then business partner in the studio who ran the business end of things. I'd been there for probably 6 months or so, and he calls and says, "Neil Young is standing in the lobby."
Okay.
I went, "Okay, what does he want?" He said, "I think he wants to do a record here."
Okay.
Okay. And the first thought that crossed my mind is nobody wanted to work on a solo record with Neil because his records didn't sound very good. He didn't care
Yeah.
about the engineering side. So here's a picture of the lobby of Triad Recording
Okay. Got some gold
where
records on the
he,
wall. Yeah. It's
yeah,
a good looking studio. Well, yeah.
and so I walk in and he sees me and goes, "Oh, hey man, I remember you. You worked at Criteria." And I went, "Yeah." "Oh, what do you want to do?" He goes, I want to do a record." And I said, "Okay, when?" He goes, "Now."
Like,
And I said, "Well, where's the band? Where's the gear? Where's the work order from Warner Brothers?"
yeah.
And he walks over to a telephone, which was
Right there
on
on that
that
little table.
table.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and he looks at me and goes, "Is it okay if I make a short long distance call on your phone?" I went, "Sure." And he calls Warner Brothers in Burbank, goes, "Oh," to the receptionist, no less. He goes, "Oh, hey, this is Neil Young calling. I'm about to start a record. Where am I? Oh, Triad Recording in Fort Lauderdale. Can you please," I think he said, "deposit $1 million in my account or something." We all just went, "Whoa," mind blown. And he put me on the phone with the receptionist, and I said, "Well, whoever is running your business side of the A&R department, I need them to generate a work order." And yeah, so Neil took me out in the parking lot. He had a 1954 Ford station wagon, two-tone, kind of pink-ish and
Okay.
white, with conch shells glued to the roof, like 100 of them. And he opens up the back end and starts pulling acoustic guitars out. As a matter of fact, the car was called the Cosmic Coral Wagon, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And it starts pulling acoustic guitars out. We brought them in, opened the lids, let them acclimate. And over the course of the next like 10, 11, 12 months, it was just Neil, myself, and my assistant. Um, he would just sit down and we would record him playing on his acoustic guitar, 87 on the acoustic, 87 on his vocal. And he would just play something. And it ended up becoming the album Comes a Time, which people say was his second most commercial release.
Okay.
Also, stuff made it from there, from those sessions on to Hawks and Doves and
Okay.
Decade and stuff. But it was just the three of us,
Wow.
very casual, normal hours. He'd show up at 10, 11, maybe noon and work until 5, 6, 7, 8.
Well, that's
No,
nice.
cocaine 24-hour sessions. And it was so laid back. But I learned the single most valuable thing in my entire career from those sessions, early in those sessions. Um, he said, "You spend a lot of time worrying about equalizers and compressors. Forget it. For the rest of the record, I don't want you to touch a compressor or an equalizer. I want you to listen to the performance. That's what we're after here. Does the
Okay.
song touch your heart? Is my performance the way it should be on that song? Because I'm going to look up at you through that glass. And if you go like that, I'm going to let it ring out and we'll have a take."
Wow.
And that was the day I realized the performance is much more important than an equalizer or a compressor.
How many times have we heard that on panels with Rob and all those guys? They talk about capturing a great performance as the primary goal.
Yeah.
You know.
And I was reading just a few days ago the book Shaky, a Neil Young biography. And he talks about, yeah, I went to a place in Fort Lauderdale called Triad, worked with a couple of young kids, me.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, somewhere he says something, but the record sounds kind of muffled, which actually, I've got to say, by the way, cleaning out a garage 20 years ago in
Okay.
my house in California. And
Okay.
I see this, and I pulled it out of a suitcase from the 70s. And I said to my wife, what is this? New York Safety from 1978.
Uh-huh.
Side one, New York. What the hell? I looked at the spine.
Can't really see. Oh, wait, there you go. Safety two, Neil Young. There you go.
Neil Young. So this was Neil and I were going to Nashville because I think Mo Austin at Warner Brothers said this is a great, solo acoustic album, but would you consider overdubbing a band? And of course, we didn't use a click track on any of this.
Right.
It's just Neil vibing out to whatever tempo he was
Right.
in.
And varying along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, so I made safeties of the multi tracks and of some good rough mixes that we had, and that's what this was. And why I took it out of the studio, I don't know. One day, Neil and I were tooling around, going out for dinner or something, and we were very close to Criteria. And he goes, "Want to go to Criteria and cut an acetate of what we've got?" An acetate is like a test pressing almost. You use the same lathe that you would cut the lacquer master with that eventually gets plated and becomes the stampers and all that. And you make this thing called an acetate that's good for basically one playing. So we went in there and we did this. Here's the actual acetate. Notice it's
Wow.
got the Criteria logo on there, but at some point I wrote Triad over it because we actually had done it at Triad. But
So it looks like there's 4 or 5 tracks on there.
yeah, I don't even
Okay.
remember. Let's see, it's got Sail Away, Lost in Space, Captain Kennedy, Going Back, and Human Highway, all of which made it to various Neil Young records.
Wow. See, this is the kind of this is why I do these things, because this is the kind of history I love capturing that musicians today need to know about. I'm sure there's folks that are watching that are our age and older that know everything you're talking about and appreciate hearing it firsthand from the guy that lived and experienced it. So I'm so thankful. I mean, this has been going great. We can go as long as you want because this is music history gold, in my opinion. Thank you for doing this.
Can I show
Oh,
you,
please
while we're
continue.
on the subject of Triad, before we get to Melanie, there's a shot of me
Oh
at
my
the
God,
Triad
little young
concert.
Michael. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness gracious.
there. I think this was during the Neil Young Comes a Time sessions.
I would have never guessed that's you.
Yeah,
My goodness.
it's
Okay,
me.
so what's on that picture to your by your right arm? There's a box standing up at an angle, gray
That's
box. What?
the remote control for the multi-track.
Gotcha. Wow. And can you tell who that is in the background to your left, far left of the picture?
Yeah, it's a guy named Kurt Saxemeyer who was my assistant engineer at the time,
Wow.
or actually his head's cut off. Might have been Paul Kaminsky. Is one of my two assistants.
Nice. So you did a little Cheap Trick, you did a whole bunch of Neil Dunn. Now Melanie, a lot of
Oh,
folks might know who Melanie is. I mean, she was one of the 2 or 3 female solo acts at Woodstock. She's kind of a rebel, interesting lifestyle. What did you do with Melanie?
um, remember, most people know her for the hit "I Got a Brand New Pair of Roller Skates." I got a brand new
Right?
pair.
Yeah, yeah,
I can't sing anyway. Less
yeah.
less able to
But
today.
the whole lock and key thing got her in trouble. This with the
Yeah,
record agency.
yeah,
Back,
it was about somebody losing their virginity, which was pretty, but it made it to mainstream radio back then because they didn't realize what it was really about.
and it was used in the movie Boogie Nights.
It was,
Yep.
and yeah, for that
Yeah.
reason.
Exactly.
Anyway, Melanie was married to a guy named Peter Shikarik, who was her husband, producer, manager, Svengali. And they had heard about the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young record at Criteria. being pretty much a live full band record with very few overdubs. And they wanted to do a live Melanie record in the studio. And because I was involved with that record and they heard that I was at Triad, they couldn't get into Criteria.
Hmm.
And they called me up, said, Melanie, I didn't know her, I didn't know him, but can you meet with us Monday? We want to do a live double album with an audience in the studio. So we've got studio level control on the sounds, but her performance vibe live with an audience. So I knew the program director at the big FM radio station in Miami at the time. We got him to run a daily contest where 30 people won free tickets to come in and sit on the floor out in the studio while Melanie and like seven other pieces were playing live. I mean, Melanie with an 87 on her voice, 87 on her acoustic, full drum setup. Trying to see if I've got, you can barely see it. Here's a shot of me wearing windscreens in my shirt, singing background vocals on somebody's record. But
You are
behind
singing.
me,
Wait, which one are you in? Is that you in on
the
the
one
light
with
blue?
the fake boobies using 87.
Oh,
I'm second from the right.
right, the light blue shirt and the
Um,
jeans. Yeah.
yeah, but the most important thing is the drum booth behind us. So we had the drummer in there, but there was no glass. And we had Sal DeTroia, who played almost all the acoustics on the Simon and Garfunkel stuff, playing acoustic on that record, live out in the room. A guy playing live electric out in the room. B3 grand piano and some synths, primitive synths back then. Just a full band out in the room. And then Melanie standing on a little piece of parquet wood floor playing and singing with audience members, literally like sitting with, they could have grabbed her
Yeah.
legs, they were so
Yeah.
close. And people were snorting coke, smoking joints, drinking beer. You'd occasionally get, like the top to
The
a beer
top.
can opening. um, and we did the same set list 10 nights in a row. And I had to run. Oh, the band barely wore headphones. We barely did any overdubs. It was a live album.
Yeah.
So I had to get all these sounds and run a mix, different mixes, like headphone mixes into wedges that were on the floor sitting on top of the grand piano so the band could hear themselves, plus have a general PA mix going to the audience sitting on the floor, stoned as they were, and a control room rough mix and be writing levels and getting all the compressors and EQs and being able to replicate that exactly the next night for 10 nights in a row because ultimately we took the best bars from each night on the 2 inch, edited them all together. So you couldn't have a guitar sound that didn't sound the same from
Right.
Monday to Tuesday or Wednesday. It was the single greatest engineering accomplishment of my life. My
Sounds like it.
criteria peers were very impressed and complimentary, which I was so grateful for. And
There it is. Look at that. That's awesome.
yeah, notice I still dress the same today.
Is that the same shirt you got plaid on? There you
Probably.
go.
I do love a good flannel shirt.
So that
And
album,
she just passed away a few months ago, sadly.
that album was released.
Yeah, it came out. It's called Ballroom Ballroom Streets.
Streets. I'm gonna look that sucker up. Taking some notes right now. Um, that's what you're talking about. So this is just, and now I'm getting like notes of all these albums I got to check out now since I know that you're involved with them.
Oh,
I,
and while you're looking at that, I'll talk about Cheap Trick for a moment, which
okay.
was they were on tour and they just wanted to come in and record one song, which was called "I Must Be Dreamin',"
Okay.
and they were hired to do it for an animated movie I can't remember the name of. And so their goal was, let's get a good demo of it. Maybe we'll get lucky and it'll be a master. They showed up, the gear got wheeled in. We worked civilized hours, went out to a Benihana steakhouse for dinner. Rick Nielsen is incredibly normal. He's not the guy you see on stage. He's very much a family guy,
Hmm.
great business head, really likable man. And yeah, I think we worked for like, I don't know, maybe 3 days on that project. Whether it made it into the movie or not, I do not know.
Interesting. Interesting. So now what happens? You decide, you're at Triad for a while. you replicated your success at criteria, go to Triad, kind of, make a new criteria there, and now it's time to move on. So how did you leave Triad and end up at HSR and kind of changing a role there?
In New York. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, my first daughter was born. And one day, my then not very happy wife said to me, your daughter's 9 months old and you haven't changed a diaper yet.
Hmm.
I was never home.
Ouch. Ouch. Yeah.
I would leave for the studio at 9 in the morning and get home at 2 in the morning, probably put on a different t-shirt and go fish. I'm obsessed with saltwater fishing. The
Hmm.
best time to catch fish is just before the sun comes up.
Hmm.
So I would go fishing, come home, take a shower, and go back to the studio. And my wife was extremely unhappy. Um, we lived in Fort Lauderdale or Pompano Beach, and I was working on a record with a big famous star whose name I will not mention
Okay.
that had a lot of drug and alcohol issues. And my contract for that record, I was just engineering it, said that on this date, Michael gets out at 9 p.m. It's his wife's birthday, and 2 o'clock in the morning, he's high on drugs, wouldn't let me leave the session, made some
Hmm.
comment like, if you leave, you'll never work in this business again. At some point, I got up to hit the men's room and just kept walking, walked
Hmm.
right out of the building. Looked over my shoulder once, got in my car, went home, woke up my wife and said, let's go to New York. I'm going to work there and I'm going to get a job doing audio for film and TV. And we literally took showers, went to the airport, bought a couple of tickets at the ticket counter, flew to New York. And as the cab was driving us through the Lincoln Tunnel into Manhattan, I saw a big sign that said National Video Center / Recording Studio. And I said to the cab driver, take her to this address. I'm getting out here. I walked in this place. It was a giant facility, had video shoot stages. The movie Tootsie was being done there.
Huh.
And as I was waiting to talk to somebody, Dustin Hoffman was sitting next to me on the couch dressed in drag, testing out costumes for Tootsie. I do remember thinking that's an unfortunately unattractive lady sitting next to me. I had no idea it was Dustin
He was
Hoffman.
he's ahead of his time.
Yeah, really. Um, and I got a job there doing audio post, which I knew nothing about. I'd never recorded a voiceover straight to quarter inch. I didn't know what that was all about. I
Mm-mm.
didn't know how to mix um, music and sound effects, to picture, any of
Yeah.
that stuff. So I started learning there. I got fired a year later. I'm like, why are you firing me? The clients seem to love me. Staff loves me. I know what I'm doing. They said, you sold more studio time over the last year than the vice president of sales. He's a 2% stockholder in the company. Bye bye.
Oh my goodness.
Excuse me. Because, yeah, whenever I didn't have a session, I'd go through the yellow pages, look up ad agencies, call them and say, hey, give me a shot at doing your audio post. Because we work with all the top ad agencies.
Yeah. And he
Um,
fired you for that. Oh man, that's
they
amazing.
fired me for that. I called a guy that I had met years ago. I was the 11th member of SPARS, the Society of Professional Audio Recording Studios. And one of the founding members was a guy named Howie Schwartz, who, along with my old boss, Mack Emerman at Criteria, Chris Stone of the Record Plant, Bob Lefton, I think was his name, worked on a lot of Simon and Garfunkel records, stuff like that. They started this snooty little organization of professional studios that you had to be invited into.
Hmm.
And I was actually invited. It was the original seven, and I was like the fourth guy after the original people that got invited to be in this thing. I was not a big deal in the industry, but I knew a lot of people who were a big deal. And for some reason, they asked me and Triad to be part of it. I did. I met Howie Schwartz. And when I got fired from National, I called him up and said, I just got fired from National. Um, do you have any openings? And he said, I got fired from National. And I said, really? For what? And he goes, being too entrepreneurial. And I said, me too. What did you do? And he goes, they found out I was building my own facility on the other side of town while I was still working for him. That became Howard Schwartz Recording, better known as HSR. And it was the preeminent audio post facility, probably anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
Um, it was the equivalent to criteria for audio post, which I got to tell you, having spent thousands upon thousands of hours making records and thousands of hours doing audio post for film and TV, audio post engineers work harder, work faster, work better, and their craft is harder to learn than making records because you have the element of time and artistic freedom, if you
Yeah.
will, making records. You could spend a day getting a drum sound. When you're setting up for a McDonald's jingle in New York with Steve Gadd on drums and the
Yeah.
Breckers on horns, which was
A
not an
regular
unusual,
thing back then. Yeah.
yeah, not an unusual thing for me at all. You can't sit there and say to Steve Gadd, "Okay, let me hear the high tom, doom, 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 doom." You preset your levels, you preset your compressors, you preset your EQ, you get all your mics in place. Gadd walks in the room and you say, "Let me hear the kit," and he goes, "Do do 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 doom, ka-cha, ka-cha, boom, chaka, boom, chaka, boom," and you go, "That's good, let's go."
Yeah. Time is money. Time is money.
Yep.
Wow.
So, yeah, I was again privileged to work with the most talented guys of that discipline anywhere on the planet at the time and loved every minute of it.
So now, so this is the 80s now. So technology is changing. Now we're getting synthesizers and drum machines, and there's different recording techniques out there, different hardware. But at HSR, you're really post prod now. You're not in the recording anymore. Did you notice the sound of music changing in the 80s?
Yeah, and I didn't like it. Frankly, I'm almost proud to say that I barely listened to any music. First of all, I got rid of my stereo in 1978 at home because I couldn't listen to music as a consumer anymore. I was constantly listening to what the kick drum was doing or what the vocal harmony stack was arranged like. I
You're
just
always
couldn't,
working.
yeah, I couldn't listen as a consumer. So, in the car, I would hear music that was done with drum machines, that was kind of like, I don't know, just a couple of years past Blondie, heading into the 80s.
Hmm.
And I didn't like any of it, other than some hangover acts like Hall and Oates that still played real instruments.
Yeah.
I just didn't like it and really got into doing post production, although there were a couple of times where record companies wanted me on something. Mike Thorne, who produced Tainted Love for Soft Cell, reached out to me and said, "You've got to engineer this record for me." And I'm like, "I don't do records anymore." He said, "Name your price." And I named a stupid price and he said, "Okay." So I would do
Yeah.
audio post all day long until 6 o'clock and then start a record with Mike Thorne, and work on that until maybe 3 o'clock in the morning. And then a Warner Brothers limo would take me from Manhattan out to my house in New Jersey. The limo driver would sit in my kitchen and end up eating breakfast with my kids. I would get in the back of the limo and sleep on the way back into Manhattan and go back to work. And
Jeez.
so I still did music. Sometimes I did jingles. Sometimes I did really big jingles, like I'm always working on name brand stuff, but sometimes like 30 pieces live in a room, with, Paul Schaefer's band is the
Yeah.
rhythm section, or Steve Gadd and Company is the rhythm section.
Yeah.
And
Top of the top.
yeah, and it's a different discipline. It's like you can't ever say, "Do that for me again."
And yet all the stress, the hours, the mental your stress, you still have all your freaking hair. It's amazing. I don't know. It's very, very good there. So you're doing post-production, and then you get to the late 80s, things start changing. What was next in your life?
Um, I kept getting offered a job at a place called LA Studios in Los Angeles. I'd been to LA twice to work on records, didn't really like it. Thought it was pretty, but I didn't like the industry people. Everybody wanted to know who you were, who you worked with, how you could
Yeah.
help them, blah, blah, blah. So I kept turning down the job, which was for considerably more money than I was making in New York. I'd gone through a divorce, was living in a little tiny studio apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Saw my daughters every other weekend, birthday parties,
Mm.
all that stuff. And one day I just woke up and said, "You know what? Time to move forward." And I called my daughters and said, "What would you think if I kept the apartment in New York, but also had an apartment in LA, commuted back and forth? I promise you, I'll never miss a weekend. I'll never miss a birthday party. I'll never miss a school play or any of that stuff." And they said, but Dad, Disneyland's in Los Angeles. Go. They couldn't get me out the door fast enough. So I had a place, and the deal I cut with my bosses at LA Studios was they bought me a plane ticket back and forth to New York every other weekend to be with my daughters.
Nice.
So did that for a year. Uh, and then they fired me because the reason they brought me on board was to build two large audio post facilities. They were the best on the West Coast. They wanted to be the best in the world. They didn't understand how much money and effort went into building a place that was Howie Schwartz equivalent.
Right.
And when they found out, they said, we can't do the project. Sorry, we brought you out here. Can we have the
Mm.
keys to the company Beamer? Have a nice day. Gave me like a
Wow.
month of severance and see you
Whew.
later, alligator. Um, and at that point, I stumbled into a place called Red Car, which was on a film lot in Hollywood, and they did mostly TV commercials. Um, and I got wind that the owner wanted to build an audio post facility. So I called him up and said, I'm kind of a world-class expert on audio post. You guys were a client, when I was at LA Studios. Do you want to do something together? And we met and he said, let's do it. So he put me on salary, even though he didn't have all the resources allocated to build it yet. He
Hmm.
put me on a really nice salary, gave me a company Beamer, and told me to go play golf. So for the next 9 months, I got paid to play golf every day and drive the company Beamer. And then eventually he brought me on board there, and the audio post place never materialized.
Huh.
Um, but I did open up a red car New York so that I had an excuse to go back and forth and
See
see
the
my
kids.
kids. And the New York office ended up outbilling the LA office. And I worked there for, I don't know, 2.5 years or something. And one day he did something very unkind to two of my favorite employees there and basically assigned me the task of pitting them against each other
Mm.
and then picking the winner and firing the loser. And if memory serves, they both had pregnant wives and down payments on houses.
Mm.
And I couldn't do it.
No, that's
And
brutal.
so I walked back to, I quit. I walked back to my office, and I remember putting my feet up on the desk, looking around the room, going, this is my last day here. What am I going to do? And the next thing that popped into my head was the complete vision for a business plan for what became Taxi.
Wow. I just like that. Just hit you.
Yeah, I remember thinking, I do miss working with musicians. That look on their face when they come in and listen to the first playback of a really good rhythm track.
Yeah.
That's what I miss. Maybe I should go back to making records. And the next thing that popped into my head was, how can I help those independent musicians? And you got to remember, Elisa's ADATs were just becoming a thing. Very few people had them, but I remember thinking, if home studio gear is going to get good enough and cheap enough
Hmm.
that everybody can do stuff at home, we're going to have a million frustrated musicians that won't be able to get their stuff to people in the industry because there's no filter and nobody in the industry wants to hear all of it.
Right.
So then the business plan popped into my head. I called my then girlfriend or fiance, who's now been my wife for 30 some years, said, pick me up. Why, is your car broken? Kind of. I went back to her place, and 48 hours later, I had a finished business plan for Taxi. My best friend from college, who was my RA freshman year in the dorms, and also he quit college and became a hair cutter. He actually funded the startup of Taxi,
Wow.
was basically a silent partner slash co-founder. I bought him out many years later. And that was the birth of Taxi.
You fired up your old Mac SC2, or I forget what I seen the picture. It's an old, it's one of the console SC, not
Yeah.
SC30. It was maybe a Mac 2CI and the monitor
Yeah.
on top. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember we bought that computer with the printer was like $3,700.
Yep. Yep. Those
And
things were
I'm
expensive.
actually sitting here looking about 15 feet away from me is the PC that my wife had. She was in grad school and I used her PC to write the business plan. It didn't have a mouse. You cursored up and down to get to things. It
Yeah.
ran DOS with a monochrome screen.
Yep.
I'd never touched a DOS computer in my life. Figured that out in an hour and then sat down and wrote the business plan.
And then the rest is history. Taxi started in 92, and here you are 30 something years later or so. I mean, good Lord.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing about Triad. During my time at Triad, got a call. A friend of mine who is kneeling down with the white shirt on without the baseball hat owned that remote truck, which was the only remote truck in South Florida. And I don't know if you can tell, but that's George Martin standing up with his arm around that long-haired kid.
Huh.
And George Martin was the music supervisor, music director on a movie called Honky Tonk Freeway.
Okay.
And they needed to record a live marching band on a football field in stereo for the movie.
Okay.
So my friend Peter with the truck got the call, and we all jumped in, and we're all friends. And so we jumped in, we drove up to Central Florida and got to spend the day with George Martin. And after the sessions, hung out in the remote truck with George for like 3 hours, asking him about Beatles stuff.
Wow.
That was quite amazing.
It's a
Anyway, so
pretty cool looking remote truck.
yeah, it was made with one of those old GMC, whatever they were called. So
Yeah. It just looks like it's
anyway,
got a bunch of, it just looks cool. Yeah.
there's George.
Wow. And you just got to hang out and talk Beatles.
That's me. Yeah.
Yep. Jeez.
Anyway, um, so yeah, Taxi was a thing. The company was probably 2 years old. Rob Shirelli, who is a multi-talented engineer, producer, mixer that's got 5 or 6 Grammys, 100 gold and platinum records. Um, I engineered and kind of co-produced some demos with Rob when he was 19 or 20 years old. He was living in Boston. I was living in New York. He read an interview with me maybe and like Recording Engineer Producer magazine and tracked me down. And I ended up working with him and we became pretty friendly, but not close friends. Anyway, jump ahead many years. I lived in LA. He moved out here. We were becoming closer and closer friends. He was one of the original 7 Taxi screeners,
Ah,
and a guy named Rich Ezra, who was like screener number 5, who ran the A&R. It was a retired, meaning probably got fired, A&R person that started the A&R 411 directory. And Rich was teaching at Musicians Institute or somewhere, and he got to invite like 100 people to a private um, audience with Phil Spector.
hmm.
And
Legend.
yeah, I called up Shirelli and said, "You want to go?" And we went. I think maybe we brought our girlfriends or wives with us. Phil Spector was like an hour and a half late, finally shows up for this thing. And at first, he was just all over the place, very ADHD, however you say that.
That's right.
And Rob and I were looking at each other like, well, this was a complete waste of time. And then all of a sudden, like somebody threw a switch in Phil Spector, gold started dripping from his mouth. And Shirelli and I are looking at each other going, oh my God, we're so incredibly privileged to be in this room
Yeah.
and hear this stuff. So, Phil talked for like an hour, hour and a half. It's over. My wife went to the ladies' room. Rob and Teresa, I think, went home. And I walked into the bar to get a Coke. And as I walk in the bar, I see Phil Spector sitting in a kind of semicircular, old school padded leather booth,
Hmm.
holding court with 3 or 4 ladies. And I walked up to him and extended my hand over the table and said, Mr. Spector, I was in the room for your speech. Mind blowing. I'm an engineer, producer, and just everything you said was incredible. So thank you for taking the time to do this today. And he goes, what do you do, man? And I said, I have just recently started a company called Taxi. It's an independent A&R company. He goes, I've heard about your little company. It's cool what you're doing. And he goes, here, I want you to have this. And he pulls this off of his lapel
Yep.
back to mono. Phil, people in the industry knew about Phil's back to mono movement. He wanted to make more records in mono. He would go to like an AES show wearing this on his lapel, and everybody was aware of it. But I got this one
He took it
from
off his lapel and gave it to you.
and gave it to me.
Wow.
And one of his 2 bodyguards, both of his bodyguards actually, were guys that I became very close friends with. One in particular, David Kessel, whose dad was Barney Kessel, the jazz
Yeah.
guitarist,
Classic. Yeah.
who would bring his sons to Phil Spector sessions that he would play on. And one day Phil said to the sons when they were like 13 years old, Barney, why don't you go home to your wife let the kids hang out with me. And
Okay.
he introduced a couple of 13-year-olds to every form of debauchery that you can probably think of. And they became his trusted, like, sons he never had, and eventually were his bodyguards. They were the actual bodyguards the night that Shirley and I went to see him speak.
Wow.
And through David Kessel, Phil knew who I was. Phil's daughter knew who I was. I met Phil for a moment when he gave me the back to mono button. And after the whole thing happened with Phil allegedly murdering that young lady at a party at his house, and he went to prison. Um, One day this shows up in an envelope, and I'm going, "Oh, it's Christmas
Christmas
time."
card.
Somebody,
Yeah.
yeah, somebody sent me a nice card. I open it up.
It's, it's
Phil Spector and his
wow.
daughter had signed the card. This is from 2007.
Wow.
The
Christmas
Spector.
cards from prison. That's a
Yeah,
country song waiting to happen right there. My goodness.
absolutely.
I don't understand why anyone would want to go back to mono, but he's a legend. All the things he did. I mix in mono all the time because of my hearing situation, but I eventually go to stereo. So that's a unique concept, but I guess, that was
Well,
his
I
thing.
gotta. Um, I don't know if you were a taxi member back then, but many years ago, I interviewed Jeff Emmerich, the Beatles engineer,
That was before my time.
um,
Yeah.
at one of the road rallies, and that was kind of a crowning achievement of my career. To because that's what inspired me to get in the music business, was looking at pictures of Jeff Emmerich and George Martin
Yeah.
standing over a console that had paint on faders on it, back in Abbey Road. And I used to just literally, like other kids, be looking at Playboy centerfolds. I was looking at those guys, just like, this is what I need to do with my life.
And that's the passion. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's
Yeah.
that's the thing. A lot of folks in the industry, I've been talking about music stuff for a long time. I've been doing music for 40 years. And there's musicians that just know that's what they want to be. You knew you wanted to be an engineer. I knew I wanted to be a saxophone player. Some folks know they want to be a singer. You know, I think that passion is really important. If you don't have the passion, doesn't mean you can't be successful. But if you have the passion, I think it's going to be an indicator of potential success. And you obviously had that passion,
You have to have the passion, and the passion has to drive the work ethic.
the discipline.
Yeah, and I learned that at Criteria. And had I not gotten my first job at Criteria, I'd probably be an attorney or something now.
Okay,
So,
so I said I was done, but I remember something else now. You showed that picture of the remote bus and George Martin, and you talked for 3 hours about the Beatles stuff. Was there anything George Martin shared with you that just jumps out that like, oh my gosh, mind blowing, whatever?
um,
Or just the fact he was present there and it's so historically important. Any memories?
there were a couple things I should not repeat. It would
Okay,
be disrespectful to all
fair.
parties involved. One of them was about John Lennon and Brian Epstein.
Okay,
Read the book, The Lives of John Lennon, which was considered blasphemy when it came out.
okay.
Um, One of my earlier screeners was the bass player in the Plastic Ono band, Yoko Ono's band, and he toured, spent extensive time with John and Yoko on the road in sessions, whatever, and he verified a couple of unsavory things that
Mm,
George Martin had told us about. But above all, George Martin, other than sharing those unsavory things, was a true gentleman, very British, very musical. And frankly, if I walked away from that hangout with him remembering anything, it was kind of Tommy Dowd-esque, which is,
mm.
you need to know when to get out of the way and let the musicians do their thing, but you also need to know at what point do I step into the conversation, and how do I act as a psychologist to get them to think that the idea that I just laid on them is their idea, and isn't it great? Which
Yeah,
is a big part of producing, which is getting the band to get behind the idea that rescues them from damaging what their goal is. So I think that George and Tommy um, shared that ethos and those skills, and so that's what I learned from hanging out with him. But
fantastic.
we were asking about. Sometimes we'd ask about microphones. He didn't know because Jeff Emmerich was engineering.
Wow.
there was also a really good book called Here, There, and Everywhere, written by Jeff Emmerich.
Hmm.
Here, Hear versus Heer. Here, There, and Everywhere. I've read every Beatles book I could ever get my hands on, and for my money, that was the best. And frankly, not incredibly flattering.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me think that it was very real. And then I got to know Jeff, and Shirelli and I went out to dinner one night, like a 4 hour dinner with Jeff Emmerich before the road rally. And just, yeah, the stuff that's in that book and the stuff that Jeff Emmerich told me. He was hanging out with my wife having tea in my hotel room at the Westin before he came down and did his thing on stage.
Hmm.
And just every time he opened his mouth, it's like, there's a Beatles thing I never heard before.
Yeah.
But
It's
he
in,
would get much more excited talking microphones and how to tune a kick drum, uh, just engineering stuff got him very
gotcha.
excited.
Wow. Well, we've been almost 2 hours here. We're on an hour and 45 or so, and it's been fantastic. Is there anything I haven't asked you, anything you want to bring up I might know about, anything you want to add before we close out?
I'm looking around to see if I have any other relics I haven't shown you. I don't think I do. Um,
Your takeaway, if you look back at your career, I mean, Taxi is what most folks know you for because you kind of invented the business and have helped thousands of musicians pursue and fulfill their dreams. So pre-Taxi, what would you like to be remembered for as an engineer?
um, if I had to pick a record, it would be the Melanie record, Ballroom Streets. I mean, you
Okay.
got to remember when you listen to it, and the YouTube videos are just horrible. So I
Gotta
recommend not
gotta go
listening
find it.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound that great on Spotify either. But only other engineers working at a very high level, when they've seen the drawing of my room layout or heard what we did, or like, wow, you go, bro. They understood. And to me, it wasn't that I was so great that I pulled it off. It was that it showed the depth of what I had learned at Criteria and from the people I'd learned it from. Every one of these things we talked about today all resulted in me building Taxi.
Mm,
My passion for musicians, more than music, actually.
mm.
Um, my passion for helping them. The studio was all about helping them be the best they could. I learned that from Tommy Dowd. Doing audio post production, working, with the Tommy Dowds of audio post in New York, who basically laughed at me. Oh, you're a record guy. Okay, so you've earned a half a dozen gold and platinum records. You don't know shit about what we do.
Yeah.
And but yet they opened their arms and invited me in and taught me, and I learned from the best there. I don't think I ever became as good as any of them, but in many ways, that Melanie record was the culmination of everything I'd learned from the folks at Criteria and from Neil Young saying, don't worry about the equalizers and
Yeah.
compressors, worry about the performance. Well, on the Melanie record, that's exactly what I had to do. Was like, while my assistant's freaking out, going, the bass sounds too tubby. I'm like, let it be tubby.
Yeah. We
I'm not going to,
run with the performance. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not going to stop this energy to get a better bass sound.
Yeah. Fantastic. Amazing how things came full circle from Tommy Dowd up front to later on George Martin. And that reminds you what Tommy Dowd taught you. So there's some consistencies about professionalism and the bigger picture. That's really cool.
And the fact that I got to run Triad Recording and eventually got to run Howie Schwartz, I was the studio manager there for 5.5 years, as well as being the engineer,
Well,
and had to work with, major ad agencies and big prima donnas. All that came full circle into giving me the various skills that I needed to do Taxi.
yeah.
I can speak and think authoritatively on audio post because I've done hundreds of commercials. I
Right.
can think and speak authoritatively on records because I've worked on countless thousands of hours of records.
Right.
Lucky guy,
Fantastic.
luckiest
Yes.
guy
I
I
mean,
ever met.
you've lived a blessed life and you're still thriving. and taxis thriving, and the music industry continued to change, but you're still relevant, and there'll always be need for new musicians. So, Michael, I want to thank you personally for spending the time with me. It took us a while to get my schedule open so that I could get with you finally. But man, I'm glad we did. This has been gold. I've got a lot of editing to do just to make sure I can make this all fit. I don't know. I don't know how much I'm going to cut. There's so much gold here. It's probably going to be an hour and a half video when we're done.
Or
But
do part one, part two, part three.
I might. We'll see how it flows. But man, I really, really thank you for your time. Appreciate you. Appreciate our friendship. Look forward to chatting
As do
again.
I.
And thank you so much.
You are so welcome. I hope people get something from this.
I'm sure they will.